May 1, 1945, Berlin. The Führerbunker trembles under Soviet artillery fire. In the concrete corridors, among scattered papers and abandoned uniforms, Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, the man who controlled access to the Führer himself, prepares his final exit. For 12 years, he managed the machinery of Nazi power from the shadows, signing orders, coordinating resources, deciding who lived and who disappeared. Now, as the Third Reich collapses in flames and rubble, witnesses see him leave the bunker complex into the chaos of burning streets. Some report his death during the breakout. Others claim sightings in South America years later. For 3 decades, his fate remained one of history's most debated mysteries. This is the story of the man who vanished on the last day of Nazi Germany, and the investigation that finally revealed the truth no one expected to find. Berlin, 1933. In a modest office on Wilhelmstrasse, Martin Bormann sat behind a desk piled with membership applications, disciplinary reports, and personnel files. At 33 years old, he possessed neither the military bearing of the Wehrmacht generals nor the oratorical fire of the propaganda chiefs. What he had was something far more valuable in the emerging Nazi state, an understanding of bureaucratic power. Bormann had joined the Nazi Party in 1927, member number 60,508. His early years were unremarkable, a conviction for participating in a political murder in 1924, followed by prison time that he used to study the party structure. He observed that real power in any organization flows not from the podium, but through the daily management of personnel, resources, and access. While others sought the spotlight, Bormann chose the shadows. By 1933, Hitler had become chancellor, and the Nazi Party transformed from a revolutionary movement into the machinery of state. Bormann served as chief of staff to Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy. The position seemed secondary, but it placed Bormann at the intersection of party administration and government policy. He processed applications, approved promotions, and maintained the records that determined who held power and who disappeared into obscurity. The Nazi Party membership book became his instrument. Every promotion, every privilege, every act of loyalty or betrayal passed through his office. He knew which officials were competent and which were merely loud. He knew who owed favors and who held grudges. Most importantly, he knew that Hitler, despite his public image as an all-knowing leader, relied heavily on those who managed the details he found tedious. Bormann's method was systematic. He arrived early, stayed late, and answered every memo with precision. When officials needed Hitler's approval for a project, they learned to route their requests through Bormann. When commanders needed resources, they discovered that Bormann's signature could accelerate or delay shipments. Slowly, invisibly, he became indispensable. The contrast between his public profile and his actual influence was striking. Photographs from the era show him as a stocky, unremarkable figure, usually standing in the background of official gatherings. Newsreels rarely mentioned his name, yet party insiders understood that to bypass Bormann was to risk Hitler's displeasure, not because Bormann complained, but because he controlled what information reached the Führer. By 1941, when Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland on his bizarre peace mission, Bormann seized his opportunity. Hitler appointed him head of the party chancellery and, shortly after, his personal secretary. The position consolidated everything Bormann had built. He now controlled not just party administration, but access to Hitler himself. Every letter, every report, every visitor passed through his hands. He decided what Hitler saw, when he saw it, and how it was presented. Historical records show the scope of his influence. He managed the exploitation of occupied territories, coordinated the seizure of property from Jewish families, and oversaw the use of forced labor in war industries. His orders shaped policy across Nazi-controlled Europe, yet most were signed simply on behalf of the Führer. The machinery of genocide and exploitation ran on paperwork, and Bormann controlled the paperwork. Those who worked with him noted his peculiar combination of efficiency and ruthlessness. He never raised his voice, rarely made threats, but officials who crossed him found their careers ended abruptly. His personnel files contained detailed notes on every party member's reliability, competence, and loyalty. In the Nazi state, where paranoia was policy, such information was power. By 1943, as the war turned against Germany, Bormann's influence grew even stronger. Hitler increasingly withdrew from public life, spending more time in his headquarters and less time managing the day-to-day governance of the Reich. Bormann filled the vacuum. Generals discovered that their battlefield requests required Bormann's approval. Ministers learned that their budgets depended on his support. Even Goebbels and Goering, once secure in their positions, found themselves competing for influence with a man who had never given a stirring speech or commanded a military unit. The machinery Bormann built continued functioning even as Allied bombs reduced German cities to rubble and Soviet armies drove westward. The bureaucracy processed reports, filed documents, and maintained order within the collapsing state. Bormann ensured that the Nazi apparatus kept grinding forward, extracting resources from occupied territories, moving prisoners between camps, and diverting material to projects Hitler considered essential. Yet for all his power, Bormann remained virtually unknown to the German public. While Goebbels dominated the newsreels and Goering displayed his medals, Bormann worked in offices and conference rooms. He accumulated power through persistence, not charisma, through control of information, not public acclaim. By April 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin, he was arguably the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany and one of the least recognized. Berlin, April 1945. The Führerbunker lay 30 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Gardens, a claustrophobic maze of concrete rooms and corridors designed to withstand aerial bombardment. The air smelled of damp concrete, diesel fuel from the generators, and the unwashed bodies of people living underground for weeks. Soviet artillery fire provided constant percussion, shaking dust from the ceiling and making conversation difficult. Bormann moved through these corridors with the same methodical purpose he had brought to party administration. While others panicked as the military situation deteriorated, he maintained his routines, organizing meetings, processing reports, ensuring that Hitler's orders, no matter how disconnected from reality, were transmitted to units that often no longer existed. The bunker complex housed roughly 40 people during those final weeks. Hitler and Eva Braun occupied the private quarters. Goebbels and his family lived in the upper bunker level. Military officers, secretaries, guards, and staff crowded into the remaining spaces. Bormann claimed a small office where he continued managing what remained of the Nazi party apparatus. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, later described the atmosphere as surreal. Above ground, Berlin burned. The Red Army advanced street by street, building by building. Wehrmacht soldiers, many of them teenagers or elderly men of the Volkssturm, fought hopeless defensive actions. Civilians huddled in cellars, waiting for the end. Below in the bunker, Hitler studied maps of armies that no longer existed and issued orders to units that had already surrendered. Bormann observed it all with careful attention. He took notes during Hitler's military conferences, where the Führer moved imaginary divisions across maps while his generals stood silent, knowing the truth but unwilling to speak it. He recorded Hitler's increasingly erratic orders: execute deserters, destroy infrastructure, fight to the last man. He maintained the fiction that the Reich would somehow survive. The contrast between expectation and reality had reached grotesque proportions. Hitler spoke of relieving armies that would march to Berlin's rescue. The truth was that Army Group Vistula had disintegrated. The 12th Army under General Wenck was surrounded and scattered, and Steiner's assault force, on which Hitler pinned desperate hopes, existed largely in name only. Radio reports from commanders in the field described collapse and chaos. Bormann filed these reports and presented edited versions to Hitler. On April 22, during a military conference, Hitler finally acknowledged the inevitable. The Reich was defeated. His generals had betrayed him. He would remain in Berlin and die there. Bormann, along with others present, urged him to leave the city, to continue leading from Bavaria or Austria. Hitler refused. He would dictate his political testament, arrange his personal affairs, and end his life on his own terms. What happened next revealed Bormann's priorities. While others focused on escape plans or securing their own futures, Bormann concentrated on documenting Hitler's final wishes. He ensured that the Führer's political testament was properly typed, witnessed, and prepared for transmission to the outside world. He arranged for multiple copies to be carried out of Berlin by different couriers. He managed the dictation of Hitler's personal will. The bureaucrat remained faithful to his function, even as the state collapsed around him. The bunker's daily routine continued with mechanical precision. Meals were served at scheduled times. Situation conferences followed their established format. Staff maintained their duties. This adherence to normalcy in the face of apocalypse reflected both the psychological need for structure and Bormann's insistence on maintaining order. If the Reich was ending, it would end according to proper procedures. Soviet forces fought their way closer. By April 28, they were within blocks of the Chancellery. Artillery fire became constant. The ventilation system struggled to filter out the smoke and dust from burning buildings. Communications with the outside world grew intermittent. Radio messages reported the execution of Himmler's peace negotiations with the Western Allies, a betrayal that enraged Hitler and prompted a final purge of suspected traitors. On April 29, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony witnessed by Goebbels and Bormann. Immediately afterward, Hitler dictated his final political testament. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the party, appointed Admiral Dönitz as his successor, and assigned various positions in the government that would succeed him. Bormann witnessed the document, ensuring its legal validity according to Nazi administrative standards. The testament reflected Hitler's unwavering convictions and his refusal to accept responsibility for the catastrophe. He blamed the Jews for starting the war, the generals for losing it, and his subordinates for betraying him. He expressed no remorse for the millions killed, the cities destroyed, or the civilization shattered. The document was purely administrative, a transfer of power, a final arrangement of affairs. Bormann made certain it was completed correctly. As April ended and May began, everyone in the bunker understood that the end had arrived. Hitler prepared for suicide. Goebbels planned to kill his children and himself. Others contemplated escape attempts through the Soviet lines. Bormann faced a decision. He could die with Hitler, demonstrating ultimate loyalty. He could surrender, facing certain execution or imprisonment. Or he could attempt escape, joining the millions of refugees, soldiers, and officials trying to survive Germany's collapse. April 30, 1945, shortly after 3 p.m., a single gunshot echoed through the Führerbunker. Staff members waited several minutes before entering Hitler's private quarters. They found him dead from a gunshot wound, Eva Braun beside him, killed by cyanide. The man who had launched a war that killed tens of millions had ended his own life in a concrete room beneath a burning city. Bormann's reaction was characteristically methodical. He verified the deaths, ensured that the bodies were carried upstairs to the Chancellery Garden, and supervised their cremation in a shell crater. Soviet artillery continued falling. The improvised funeral pyre burned, while Red Army soldiers fought German defenders less than a quarter-mile away. Bormann watched to ensure the procedure was completed, then returned to the bunker. The cyanide capsules distributed among Hitler's inner circle represented a peculiar intersection of Nazi ideology and bureaucratic thoroughness. The Reich had anticipated this moment, prepared for it, and issued the appropriate materials. SS doctors had tested the poison on Hitler's dog Blondie just hours earlier to verify its effectiveness. The regime that had industrialized mass murder now provided its leaders the means for individual self-destruction. With Hitler dead, the command structure that Bormann had helped maintain for 12 years collapsed instantly. Goebbels assumed nominal leadership for the few hours he remained alive. By evening, he and his wife had poisoned their 6 children and then killed themselves. Göring was in American custody. Himmler would be captured and commit suicide within days. The Nazi leadership was dissolving, each member choosing death or attempting escape. Bormann chose escape. His reasoning, never explicitly documented, can be inferred from his actions. He was 55 years old, had spent 12 years at the center of Nazi power, and knew that Allied authorities were compiling lists of war criminals for prosecution. He also possessed detailed knowledge of the regime's crimes, having administered many of them personally. Capture meant certain execution. Death in the bunker meant no chance of survival. Escape offered at least a possibility. The breakout began on the night of May 1-2. The plan involved leaving the bunker in small groups, moving through Berlin's subway tunnels and destroyed streets, crossing the Spree River, and reaching German lines to the west, assuming such lines still existed. It was desperate and poorly conceived, but remaining in the bunker meant certain capture when Soviet forces completed their encirclement. Witness testimony regarding what happened next is fragmentary and contradictory. Arthur Axmann, Hitler youth leader, later testified that he saw Bormann's body on the Weidendammer Bridge after an explosion from Soviet fire. He claimed Bormann was clearly dead. Other witnesses reported seeing Bormann alive after that point, moving through the darkness with other survivors. Several accounts placed him near Lehrte station, attempting to navigate through Soviet positions. The confusion was understandable. Berlin on that night was chaos incarnate. Buildings burned, illuminating scenes of urban combat. Soviet and German forces fought at close range. Thousands of soldiers, officials and civilians attempted to flee westward. Bodies littered the streets from days of fighting. Identifying individuals in the darkness, smoke and confusion was nearly impossible. What is documented? Bormann left the bunker, carrying minimal possessions and whatever documents he considered essential. He was seen by multiple witnesses during the early stages of the breakout. He attempted to cross Soviet lines using Berlin's infrastructure of tunnels, bridges, and ruined buildings. And then he disappeared from reliable historical record. The mystery of Bormann's fate began immediately. As Allied forces occupied Germany and the full scope of Nazi crimes became apparent, war crimes investigators compiled lists of wanted officials. Bormann's name appeared near the top. He had signed orders authorizing forced labor, property confiscation, and the exploitation of occupied territories. His role in the Holocaust, while administrative rather than operational, made him a priority target. Yet, unlike Göring, Hess, Speer, and others who faced justice at Nuremberg, Bormann could not be found. The Soviets claimed no knowledge of his capture. Western allies found no trace of him in their zones. No body was definitively identified as his. The man who had spent 12 years managing Nazi bureaucracy had vanished. The Nuremberg tribunal proceeded with his prosecution in absentia. In October 1946, the court found Martin Bormann guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced him to death by hanging. The sentence could not be carried out because the condemned was missing. The judgment stood as historical record, but provided no conclusion to the question that would dominate discussions for the next 3 decades. What happened to Martin Bormann on the night of May 1–2, 1945? 3 theories emerged. First, that he died during the breakout, killed by Soviet fire or by his own hand, and his body was never properly identified in the chaos. Second, that he escaped Berlin and died somewhere in Germany during the chaotic final days of the war. Third, that he escaped Germany entirely and lived in hiding, possibly in South America, where other Nazi officials had fled. Each theory had supporters, each had gaps in evidence, and each kept alive the question that investigators, historians, and journalists would pursue for decades. Where was Martin Bormann? Buenos Aires, 1948. In a café on Avenida Corrientes, men speaking German in hushed voices discussed news from Europe. Nazi hunters were active, hunting fugitives. The Nuremberg trials had concluded, but prosecutions continued. Some officials had surrendered or been captured, others had vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe, and some had followed the rat lines, escape routes that stretched from Germany through Italy to South America. The theory that Martin Bormann escaped to South America gained credibility from documented cases. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistics, would be discovered living in Argentina under a false name in 1960. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, had also fled to South America. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, found sanctuary in Bolivia. If these men could escape, why not Bormann? The rat lines were real and well documented. Catholic clergy, particularly Franciscan friars in Italy, helped Nazi officials obtain false papers and passage to Argentina, Paraguay, and other countries with governments sympathetic or indifferent to Nazi fugitives. The International Red Cross, deceived by forged documents, issued travel papers to war criminals using assumed names. Intelligence agencies, already focused on the emerging Cold War, sometimes assisted escape operations in exchange for information about Soviet activities. Simon Wiesenthal, the Vienna-based Nazi hunter, became convinced that Bormann had escaped. His reasoning was methodical. Bormann was intelligent, methodical, and had access to Nazi financial resources. He had maintained contacts throughout the Reich's administration. He understood how bureaucracies functioned and how to exploit their weaknesses. Wiesenthal believed that a man with such skills could navigate the post-war chaos. Reports began surfacing. Witnesses claimed to have seen Bormann in various locations: a monastery in Italy, a farm in Bavaria, a hotel in Argentina. Each report was investigated. Each proved unreliable. Some witnesses were sincere but mistaken, having seen someone who resembled Bormann. Others were motivated by reward money. Some were simply publicity seekers. The signal-to-noise ratio in the search for Bormann was extremely low. The West German government maintained an active investigation. Prosecutors in Frankfurt handled the Bormann case, collecting testimony, examining documents, and following leads. In 1954, they declared him legally dead, a bureaucratic necessity given the lack of evidence either way. The declaration did not end the investigation. If Bormann were found alive, the death declaration would be reversed and prosecution would proceed. The contrast between the methodical investigation and the sensational rumors was stark. Serious investigators worked through archives, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed the limited hard evidence available. Meanwhile, newspapers published breathless accounts of Bormann's sightings, each more dramatic than the last. He was reportedly living as a monk in Italy. He supposedly ran a fishing business in Argentina. He allegedly controlled a network of hidden Nazi assets worth millions. The most persistent theory placed him in South America, specifically Argentina, under Juan Perón's government. Perón had maintained friendly relations with Germany during the war and welcomed German immigrants afterward. Buenos Aires had a substantial German-speaking population. The country's distance from Europe and its lack of extradition treaties made it an attractive destination for fugitives. Yet, despite extensive investigation, no concrete evidence emerged. The CIA conducted searches, interviewing expatriate Germans and monitoring suspicious individuals. Israeli intelligence, motivated by the hunt for Eichmann and other war criminals, pursued every lead. West German authorities worked with international partners to track financial transactions that might reveal Bormann's whereabouts. Nothing definitive materialized. The problem was not lack of effort, but the nature of the search. Post-war Europe and South America were full of displaced persons, refugees, and people using assumed names for various reasons. Population records were incomplete or destroyed. Borders were porous, documents were easily forged. In this environment, a person who wanted to disappear could do so effectively, especially if they had resources and preparation. Some investigators questioned whether Bormann would have had the opportunity to escape. The breakout from the bunker occurred under desperate circumstances. Berlin was surrounded under constant bombardment and filled with Soviet troops. Crossing into Western zones required traversing hundreds of miles through Soviet-occupied territory. Reaching Italy meant additional travel through a Germany where infrastructure had collapsed and Allied authorities controlled transportation routes. Yet counter-arguments existed. Bormann had spent years managing Nazi resources and maintaining networks. He knew people throughout occupied Europe. He had access to false papers, money, and contacts. Several days passed between Hitler's death and the complete Soviet occupation of Berlin. In that window, with planning and luck, escape was theoretically possible. The debate continued through the 1950s and 1960s. Each reported sighting generated investigation. Each investigation yielded nothing definitive. Bormann became a symbol of Nazi evil that had escaped justice, of the post-war justice system's limitations, of the chaos that had allowed war criminals to disappear. Whether he was alive or dead, his absence prevented closure. For those who had suffered under Nazi rule, the question carried painful significance. Bormann had administered some of the regime's worst policies. His orders had affected millions of lives. The possibility that he had escaped unpunished was intolerable, yet the alternative, that he had died in Berlin and the search was futile, meant that those seeking justice were chasing a ghost. The mystery endured, frustrating investigators and haunting survivors. A bureaucrat's final act of disappearance more effective than any of the orders he had issued during 12 years of administrative tyranny. Berlin, April 16–May 2, 1945. The Battle of Berlin stands as one of history's most brutal urban combats. Soviet forces committed approximately 25 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft to the final assault on the Nazi capital. German defenders numbered perhaps 300,000, including Wehrmacht soldiers, SS units, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm militia. The fighting produced casualties on a scale difficult to comprehend. Approximately 80,000 Soviet soldiers killed, perhaps 100,000 German military casualties, and an estimated 125,000 Berlin civilians dead. Understanding this battle provides essential context for Bormann's disappearance. The city through which he attempted escape was not merely dangerous, it was experiencing organized destruction on an industrial scale. The Soviet assault began with the largest artillery bombardment in history. On April 16, Marshal Zhukov ordered the firing of 40,000 artillery pieces, mortars, and rocket launchers along a 30-mile front. The barrage lasted for hours, reducing German defensive positions to rubble and announcing that the final battle had begun. The sound could be heard hundreds of miles away. The flash of guns illuminated the night sky. The psychological effect was devastating. German defenders had prepared Berlin's outer defenses with the thoroughness that had characterized Wehrmacht engineering throughout the war. Anti-tank ditches, minefields, fortified buildings, and interlocking fields of fire created a defensive network designed to extract maximum cost from Soviet attackers. For several days, the defense held. German casualties mounted, but Soviet forces paid heavily for every mile advanced. The contrast between German determination and German capability illustrated the Reich's final predicament. Individual soldiers and units fought with skill and courage. They destroyed Soviet tanks, held defensive positions, and conducted counterattacks when possible. But ammunition ran short, food supplies dwindled, medical care became minimal, reinforcements did not arrive because there were no reinforcements. The Wehrmacht was fighting with weapons and will. But will alone could not stop the Red Army's numerical and material superiority. Soviet tactics evolved through the battle. Initial frontal assaults produced heavy casualties. Soviet commanders adapted, using artillery to pulverize buildings before infantry advanced, employing tank infantry teams to clear streets building by building, and bringing up heavy siege guns to destroy fortified positions. The Red Army learned urban warfare through practice, accepting casualties that Western militaries would have considered unsustainable. By April 25, Soviet forces had encircled Berlin. From that moment, everyone trapped in the city, soldiers, officials, civilians, faced the same choice: surrender, die fighting, or attempt escape through Soviet lines. Thousands tried the third option. Most failed. The fighting moved from Berlin's outskirts to its interior. Soviet soldiers advanced through the Tiergarten, captured the Reichstag, and closed on the government district where the Führerbunker lay buried. Each building became a fortress, each street a battlefield. German defenders used the city's infrastructure, subway tunnels, sewers, cellars, to move between positions and launch counterattacks. Soviet forces responded with flamethrowers, demolitions, and methodical clearance operations. Berlin's civilian population, numbering perhaps 2 million when the battle began, experienced the horror as victims. Soviet artillery did not distinguish between military and civilian targets. Food and water supplies failed. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Thousands sheltered in subway stations, basements, and bomb shelters. Rape became epidemic as Soviet soldiers entered the city. The liberation of Berlin, from the civilian perspective, often felt like a different form of occupation. The collapse of civil order affected everyone attempting to move through the city. No reliable maps existed for the constantly changing battle lines. Streets that were passable 1 hour became killing zones the next. Soviet patrols searched for German soldiers and officials. Desperate Wehrmacht units fought wherever they encountered Soviet forces. Artillery fire fell randomly. This was the environment through which Bormann attempted escape. On May 2, the German garrison commander surrendered. Fighting ceased gradually as individual units received the order or simply ran out of ammunition and will to continue. Soviet forces began processing tens of thousands of prisoners, searching for wanted officials, and conducting security sweeps. The Red Army had conquered Hitler's capital, but the victory came at tremendous cost. The battle's physical impact on Berlin was catastrophic. Approximately 70% of the city's buildings suffered damage. Infrastructure collapsed. Water, electricity, gas, sewage systems all failed. Rubble filled the streets. Unexploded ordnance lay everywhere. Bodies remained unburied for weeks. The city that had been the capital of the thousand-year Reich was reduced to ruins in 16 days of combat. This destruction directly affected the search for Bormann. Whatever happened to him occurred in conditions that made documentation nearly impossible. Thousands of bodies lay in Berlin's streets, many burned, crushed, or otherwise unidentifiable. Mass graves were dug to prevent disease. Soviet forces, focused on military objectives and security operations, did not systematically identify civilian dead. German authorities, having ceased to exist, could not maintain death records. If Bormann died in Berlin during the breakout, his body likely was never properly identified. If he escaped the city, he did so through an environment where normal rules of documentation and control had completely broken down. The battle that destroyed the Third Reich also destroyed the possibility of definitively answering questions about the fate of its officials. The human cost of the Battle of Berlin extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Families were destroyed, women traumatized, children orphaned. The city's infrastructure required years to rebuild. The psychological damage to survivors lasted lifetimes. Against this backdrop of suffering, the question of what happened to one Nazi official might seem minor. Yet for those pursuing justice, for those who had suffered under Nazi rule, the answer mattered profoundly. Frankfurt, 1965. In a prosecutor's office, investigators compiled volumes of testimony regarding Martin Bormann's fate. 20 years after the war's end, the official search continued. The testimonies revealed not a clear narrative, but a frustrating collection of fragments, contradictions, and ambiguities that defied resolution. Arthur Axmann provided the most cited account. As leader of the Hitler Youth, Axmann had been in the bunker during the final days and participated in the breakout attempt. He testified that he saw Bormann near the Weidendammer Bridge, attempting to cross Soviet lines with a small group that included Hitler's doctor, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger. According to Axmann, a Soviet shell exploded nearby. When Axmann looked back, he saw Bormann and Stumpfegger lying on the ground, apparently dead. This testimony seemed conclusive. Axmann was a credible witness. He had no obvious reason to lie about Bormann's death, and his account was specific about time, place, and circumstances. Yet questions remained. Axmann admitted he did not approach the bodies to verify death. He assumed they were dead from their stillness and the proximity of the explosion. In the darkness, confusion, and danger of that moment, his observation was necessarily brief. Other witnesses contradicted Axmann's account. Erich Kempka, Hitler's driver, testified that he saw Bormann alive after the bridge incident, moving through the city with other survivors. His testimony placed Bormann near Lehrter station, several blocks from where Axmann claimed to have seen him dead. Kempka described Bormann as shaken but mobile, still attempting to escape. The contradictions multiplied. Some witnesses reported seeing Bormann in various parts of Berlin in the days following May 1. Others claimed encounters with him in Bavaria in the weeks after the war. Several reported that he had been captured by Soviets and taken east. Each account was investigated, each raised more questions than it answered. The problem was not limited to conflicting testimonies about what happened. It extended to questions about witness reliability and motivation. Some witnesses were former Nazis themselves, facing prosecution or social ostracism, with potential incentives to mislead investigators. Others might have genuinely mistaken someone else for Bormann. He was not physically distinctive, and conditions in Berlin during the breakout made accurate identification difficult. Still others might have fabricated stories for attention or compensation. Prosecutors attempted to establish a chronology using multiple sources. The last completely reliable sighting of Bormann was his departure from the Führerbunker on the night of May 1-2, 1945. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. After that point, the trail became murky. Several witnesses placed him at various locations in Berlin during the breakout attempt. The reported sightings clustered in the area between the Reich Chancellery and Lehrter station, consistent with a path attempting to reach western suburbs. Then the sightings ended. No reliable witness reported seeing Bormann after approximately 2 a.m. on May 2. The absence of later sightings could mean he died during that night. Alternatively, it could mean he successfully escaped the city, and subsequent witnesses who claimed to see him elsewhere were either mistaken or lying. The testimony of those who escaped Berlin provided additional context. Hundreds of people attempted the breakout on that night. Most failed. Soviet forces controlled the main routes out of the city center. Those who tried to cross bridges or move through open areas came under fire. Many who initially escaped were captured in subsequent days as Soviet forces consolidated control. The handful who successfully reached western zones did so through combination of planning, luck, and the chaos that prevented complete Soviet control. Several witnesses described seeing bodies throughout Berlin in the days following the surrender. The scale was overwhelming. Thousands of German soldiers and civilians killed in the final battle, lying in streets, parks, and buildings. Soviet authorities organized burial details, but the process took weeks. Many bodies were never identified, simply recorded as unknown German soldier or civilian identity uncertain. This mass death created a logical problem for investigators. If Bormann died in Berlin, his body could easily have been one of thousands buried without identification. The physical evidence that might have resolved the question, a body, personal effects, dental records matched to remains, was lost in the chaos of Berlin's fall. Prosecutors had testimony, but no physical proof. Some investigators questioned whether witnesses who claimed Bormann died might have been protecting him. If former Nazis believed Bormann had escaped, they might have provided false testimony about his death to misdirect investigators. This theory gained some support from the documented fact that former SS officers and Nazi officials maintained networks after the war, sometimes assisting fugitives. Yet the opposite was equally plausible. Witnesses who claimed Bormann survived might have been mistaken or might have had reasons to keep alive the idea that a senior Nazi had escaped justice. The publicity surrounding the Bormann search created incentives for false reports. Media paid for stories. Books about Nazi fugitives sold well. A witness who claimed to have seen Bormann alive could gain attention and compensation. The legal process struggled with this ambiguity. German law required either proof of death or a declaration of death after a specified period. The Bormann case fell into an uncomfortable middle ground. There was testimony suggesting death, but it was contradictory and unverified. There were no remains, no physical evidence, no documents that definitively resolved the question. In 1972, West German prosecutors closed the case, declaring that Bormann almost certainly died in Berlin in May 1945. The declaration was based on weight of evidence rather than conclusive proof. It represented a legal resolution to a historical question that remained in strictly evidentiary terms unresolved. The testimony transcripts, filed in Frankfurt's archives, remain a monument to the difficulties of establishing truth in conditions of chaos and the limitations of legal processes when confronting historical mysteries. Berlin, December 7, 1972. Construction workers expanding railway lines near Lehrter station struck something unusual beneath the surface. Among the layers of dirt, rubble, and debris that had accumulated since the war, they found skeletal remains. The discovery was not surprising. Construction projects in Berlin regularly uncovered remains from the war's final battle, but these particular remains would prove significant. The workers notified authorities. Police secured the site. Forensic specialists arrived to examine the find. Initial analysis revealed two skeletons, apparently male, lying close together in soil layers consistent with 1945-era burial or concealment. The location was significant. Approximately 360 meters from the Weidendammer Bridge, in the area where witnesses had reported seeing Martin Bormann during the breakout attempt. The investigation proceeded with methodical caution. 27 years had passed since the war. Forensic techniques had improved substantially since 1945, but the remains themselves presented challenges. The skeletons were incomplete, burial in acidic soil had damaged the bones, no clothing or personal effects remained that might provide identification. The investigators had two skeletons of unknown identity, found in a location where thousands had died, requiring identification through scientific analysis. Forensic anthropologists began their work. They determined approximate age at death, height, and physical characteristics from skeletal analysis. One skeleton matched Martin Bormann's known physical parameters. Male, approximately 50-55 years old at death, around 5'7" tall, stocky build. The second skeleton's dimensions matched Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, who witnesses had placed with Bormann during the escape attempt. The match to Bormann's physical characteristics was suggestive but not conclusive. Many middle-aged German men fit similar parameters. Positive identification required more definitive evidence. In 1972, DNA analysis was not yet available for forensic use. Investigators turned to dental records. Bormann's dental records existed in Nazi party files. Like other senior officials, he had received regular dental care, and his treatment was documented. Forensic odontologists compared the skull's teeth to the documented dental work. The match was precise. The pattern of fillings, the specific teeth that had been treated, and the techniques used corresponded exactly to Bormann's records. Additional evidence supported the identification. Glass splinters found with the remains suggested that one of the deceased had been carrying something glass that broke, possibly cyanide ampules. This aligned with accounts that bunker personnel had been issued poison capsules. The location matched witness testimony about where Bormann was last seen. The presence of a second body matching Stumpfegger's dimensions corroborated accounts that the two men had been together. In April 1973, West German prosecutors announced their conclusion. The remains found near Lehrter station were those of Martin Bormann and Ludwig Stumpfegger. Based on forensic evidence and historical documentation, authorities determined that Bormann had died on May 1, 1945, during his escape attempt from the Führerbunker. He had not survived the war, had not escaped to South America, and had not lived in hiding for decades. He had died in Berlin 27 years earlier. The announcement ended decades of speculation, but raised new questions. If Bormann died in Berlin in May 1945, how had his body remained undiscovered for so long? Why had extensive searches in the 1940s and 1950s failed to find the remains? What exactly caused his death? Forensic analysis provided some answers. The soil conditions and burial depth had preserved the skeletal remains while allowing soft tissue to decay completely. The location, though searched in earlier investigations, had been covered by rubble and reconstruction. Berlin's massive rebuilding after the war had altered the landscape substantially. Areas that had been searched in 1945 looked completely different by 1972. The cause of death remained uncertain. No bullet wounds or other obvious trauma appeared on the skeletal remains. The presence of glass fragments suggested possible cyanide poisoning, but this could not be verified scientifically after 27 years. Investigators theorized that Bormann had either died from poison or from injuries that did not leave traces on bone. Given that witnesses reported explosions in the area and that Bormann had access to cyanide capsules, either scenario was plausible. The discovery created an unexpected historical resolution. For 27 years, investigators had pursued sightings, interviewed witnesses, and followed leads across continents. The truth had been literally beneath their feet, buried in Berlin's soil near where witnesses had reported seeing Bormann fall. The escaped Nazi, who had supposedly lived in South America, had actually died within hours of leaving Hitler's bunker. Yet, even definitive physical evidence did not completely end speculation. Some investigators and journalists questioned the identification. They argued that dental records could have been falsified, that the remains might have been planted, or that the forensic analysis was flawed. These objections generally came from those who had invested years in the theory of Bormann's escape and found the conclusion unsatisfying. In 1998, DNA analysis became available that could definitively resolve remaining questions. Investigators obtained DNA samples from Bormann's living relatives and compared them to DNA extracted from the skeletal remains. The match was conclusive. The remains found in 1972 were, beyond scientific doubt, those of Martin Bormann. The construction site photograph from December 1972 captured the moment when speculation became certainty. It showed a mundane scene, workers, equipment, an excavation, that marked the end of one of post-war history's most persistent mysteries. The bureaucrat who had vanished in 1945 had not really vanished at all. He had simply died, anonymously, among thousands of others in Berlin's final battle, and been buried beneath the rubble of the regime he had served. Munich, 1998. In a modern forensic laboratory, Technicians extracted DNA from bone samples that had been stored since the 1972 discovery. DNA analysis had become the gold standard for human identification, capable of providing certainty that earlier forensic methods could only approximate. The Bormann case, though legally closed, still attracted attention from historians and journalists who questioned whether the 1973 identification was correct. The DNA analysis process required obtaining samples from Bormann's living relatives. His children, born during his marriage to Gerda Buch, provided the necessary material for comparison. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to children, could establish maternal lineage. Nuclear DNA could establish paternal relationship. The combination would provide conclusive identification if the remains were indeed Bormann's. The testing proceeded through 1998. Forensic geneticists worked methodically, ensuring proper handling of samples and verification of results. By year's end, they reached their conclusion. The DNA from the skeletal remains matched the DNA from Bormann's relatives with statistical certainty. The probability that the remains belonged to someone other than Martin Bormann was effectively zero. This scientific verdict closed the case definitively. Bormann had died in Berlin on May 12, 1945. He had not escaped to South America. He had not lived in hiding for decades. He had not been captured by Soviet forces. The various reported sightings over the years had all been cases of mistaken identity, fabrication, or deliberate deception. The truth was prosaic. He had died during an escape attempt and been buried in the rubble, his body undiscovered until construction workers found it 27 years later. The DNA evidence revealed something about the nature of historical investigation. For 53 years, from 1945 to 1998, the question of Bormann's fate remained technically unresolved. Investigators had pursued leads, interviewed witnesses, and examined documentary evidence. They had developed theories ranging from death in Berlin to elaborate escape scenarios. All of this effort, all of these investigations had circled around a question that molecular biology ultimately answered with absolute certainty in a few months of laboratory work. The contrast between expectation and reality was striking. The mystery of Martin Bormann, which had generated thousands of investigative hours and countless newspaper articles, turned out to have no mystery at all. Arthur Axmann's testimony from 1945, often questioned and sometimes dismissed, had been essentially accurate. Bormann had died near the Weidendammer Bridge, approximately where Axmann had seen him fall. The elaborate theories of escape had been wrong. The truth had been buried in Berlin soil the entire time. This resolution illuminated the challenges of historical investigation. Eyewitness testimony, even from credible sources, had been questioned because it seemed too convenient or too uncertain. Physical searches, despite extensive effort, had failed to find remains that were actually present in the search area but buried under rubble. Documentary evidence, consisting largely of reports of sightings, had led investigators across continents in pursuit of a dead man. The limitations of 1940s and 1950s forensic science had made definitive identification impossible when the question could have been resolved. The DNA analysis also revealed how technological advancement changes historical understanding. Questions that were unanswerable in 1945 became answerable by 1973 using dental records and skeletal analysis. Questions that remained uncertain in 1973 became certain by 1998 using genetic analysis. Future technologies might similarly resolve other historical mysteries that currently seem intractable. For those who had pursued Bormann for decades, the DNA results brought mixed reactions. Simon Wiesenthal, who had spent years convinced that Bormann had escaped, had died in 25, 7 years after the DNA confirmation, but with knowledge of the 1973 findings. Other investigators who had followed South American leads acknowledged that their theories had been wrong. The evidence was conclusive, and scientific integrity required accepting it. The resolution affected historical understanding of the Nazi regime's final days. Bormann's death during the breakout attempt meant that virtually the entire Nazi leadership had died or been captured within days of Hitler's suicide. The regime had not maintained any continuing organization. No hidden Nazi networks had protected escaping leaders. The end had been as chaotic and complete as initial reports suggested. Yet the DNA evidence also highlighted how much confusion could arise from crisis conditions. Thousands of witnesses had been present in Berlin during the final battle. Many had seen bodies, explosions, and desperate escape attempts. From this chaos had emerged conflicting accounts that took decades to resolve. The difficulty was not lack of witnesses, but the conditions under which they witnessed events, darkness, danger, confusion, and trauma, that made reliable observation nearly impossible. The 1998 DNA report filed in German archives, represented the final chapter in a historical investigation that had spanned more than 5 decades. It demonstrated both the persistence of investigators and the power of scientific evidence. It showed how historical mysteries could endure not because evidence was lacking, but because available evidence was ambiguous or contradictory. And it proved that some questions, regardless of their significance or the effort devoted to answering them, required technological capabilities that did not exist when the questions first arose. The report's conclusion was simple, stated in the precise language of forensic science. The skeletal remains recovered in Berlin on December 7, 1972, are those of Martin Bormann, with a probability exceeding 99.99%. 53 years after his death, science had finally provided the certainty that history alone could not deliver. Nuremberg, October 1, 1946. The International Military Tribunal delivered its verdict in the case of Martin Bormann, tried in absentia for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The judgment found him guilty on both counts and sentenced him to death by hanging. The sentence could not be executed because the condemned man's whereabouts remained unknown. The tribunal rendered justice on paper while Bormann, dead for 17 months but not yet discovered, lay buried in Berlin rubble. The charges against Bormann detailed his role in the Nazi regime's criminal policies. As private secretary and head of the party chancellery, he had administered the exploitation of occupied territories, the confiscation of property from Jewish families, and the use of forced labor in war industries. His signature appeared on orders that affected millions of lives. His administrative skill had helped maintain the machinery of genocide and conquest. The tribunal heard extensive testimony about Bormann's activities. Witnesses described how he controlled access to Hitler, managed party affairs, and implemented policies that constituted war crimes. Documentary evidence included orders bearing his signature, memoranda showing his involvement in criminal activities, and testimony from subordinates who had executed his directives. The prosecution presented a comprehensive case against a defendant who was not present to answer it. Defense counsel, appointed by the tribunal to ensure procedural fairness, argued that Bormann's fate was unknown and that trying someone who might be dead violated legal principles. The tribunal rejected this argument. The evidence of Bormann's crimes was clear. His absence, whether due to death or hiding, did not eliminate the need for historical record. The trial would proceed. The guilty verdict was legally and historically significant. It established for the record that Martin Bormann had been a major war criminal, regardless of whether he could be brought to justice. It documented his role in Nazi crimes, preserving evidence that might otherwise have been lost. It demonstrated that the international community held Nazi officials accountable even when they could not be physically present. Yet the verdict also highlighted the limitations of legal justice in the aftermath of total war. Bormann's crimes were documented and judged, but he faced no punishment. Unlike Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and others who were hanged following their convictions, Bormann simply vanished from history. The legal verdict existed, but legal consequence did not. The contrast between thorough documentation and absent defendant characterized the entire Bormann case. The tribunal possessed extensive evidence of his activities, more than enough to convict him multiple times over, but without the man himself, justice remained incomplete. The verdict could establish guilt, but could not provide closure to victims or demonstrate that evil had consequences. This incompleteness reflected broader challenges in the post-war reckoning with Nazi crimes. Hundreds of thousands of individuals had participated in genocide, conquest, and exploitation. The vast majority would never face prosecution. Many died during the war. Many more disappeared into post-war chaos. Legal systems could process only a tiny fraction of perpetrators. Nuremberg tried major leaders. Subsequent trials addressed others. But most who had implemented Nazi policies at local and regional levels escaped accountability. Bormann represented a particular category of Nazi criminal, the bureaucratic administrator who enabled atrocity through paperwork rather than direct action. He had not personally killed anyone. He had not supervised concentration camps or directed massacres. But his administrative work had made these crimes possible and efficient. He had processed the orders, allocated the resources, and maintained the systems that turned ideology into industrial-scale murder. The tribunal's judgment recognized this bureaucratic culpability. Modern legal doctrine regarding crimes against humanity developed partly from such cases, establishing that administrative participation in systematic atrocities constituted criminal conduct. One need not pull a trigger or operate a gas chamber to be guilty of genocide. Those who made the machinery run bore responsibility for what the machinery produced. The October 1946 verdict entered the the historical record as a definitive legal judgment. Martin Bormann was a convicted war criminal. This status remained regardless of subsequent developments. When his remains were discovered in 1972, he was already legally dead, executed on paper 26 years earlier, though his actual death had occurred in Berlin in 1945. The Nuremberg transcript, thousands of pages documenting the trial of 24 Nazi leaders, includes Bormann's case as a unique element. The only defendant tried entirely in absentia, the only one whose fate remained unknown when judgment was rendered. Reading the transcript today reveals the tension between legal process and historical reality. The court methodically established guilt, heard evidence, and rendered judgment, while the man being judged was already beyond any earthly punishment. For historians, the Nuremberg judgment provides essential documentation of Bormann's role in Nazi crimes. For legal scholars, it demonstrates how international law adapted to prosecute crimes of unprecedented scale. For victims and survivors, it represents incomplete justice, guilt established but never punished, accountability declared but never enforced. The verdict stands as monument to both the achievement and the limitations of post-war justice. The international community had established legal accountability for aggressive war and crimes against humanity. It had tried senior Nazi officials and documented their crimes for history, but it could not reach Martin Bormann, who had vanished into Berlin's ruins, leaving behind only a paper trail of guilt and a legal judgment that arrived too late to matter. Rome, 1946. In monasteries and churches throughout Italy, Catholic clergy assisted individuals seeking passage to South America. Some of those seeking help were genuine refugees displaced by war. Others were Nazi officials using false identities to escape prosecution. The clergy, motivated by various factors including anti-communism, Christian mercy, or in some cases sympathy for fascism, helped thousands obtain documents and passage. The escape routes, later called rat lines, followed established patterns. Fugitives would make their way through Germany into Austria, then across the Alps into northern Italy. In Italy, contacts would provide false papers, often claiming the bearer was a refugee or displaced person. The International Red Cross, operating under wartime protocols and deceived by forged documents, would issue travel papers. From Italian ports, ships sailed to Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and other South American countries. The system was surprisingly organized. Bishop Alois Hudal in Rome actively assisted German fugitives, believing he was saving anti-communists who would be valuable in the coming Cold War. Franciscan friars operated safe houses in Genoa and other cities. Croatian priests, particularly those associated with the Ustaše movement, maintained networks that helped both Croatian and German fascists escape. Intelligence agencies focused on Soviet threats sometimes turned blind eyes to war criminals who provided information. Adolf Eichmann followed this route successfully. After capture by Americans, he escaped from a detention camp in 1946, obtained false papers identifying him as Ricardo Clement, and reached Argentina in 1950. He lived there relatively openly until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. Joseph Mengele also escaped through Italy, reaching Argentina and later moving to Paraguay and Brazil, where he died in 1979. Klaus Barbie, with assistance from American intelligence, reached Bolivia, where he lived until extradition to France in 1983. These successful escapes proved that Nazi officials could disappear into post-war chaos and build new lives under assumed identities. The question investigators asked for decades was, if Eichmann, Mengele, and others escaped, why couldn't Bormann have done the same? He had been more powerful than any of them, had better access to resources, and had more reason to flee given his prominence in the regime. The answer, revealed only by forensic evidence decades later, was simple. Bormann died before he could attempt such an escape. The men who successfully followed the rat lines had survived the war's end, navigated the immediate post-war period, and then organized their departures. Bormann died during the chaotic final hours in Berlin, unable to execute any escape plan he might have prepared. Yet, the existence of successful escapes explained why reports of Bormann sightings seemed credible for so long. If Eichmann could live openly in Argentina for a decade, why couldn't Bormann? If Mengele could swim at public beaches, why couldn't Bormann be the German-speaking man reported in Paraguay? The documented cases provided plausibility to the theory of Bormann's survival. The contrast between those who escaped and Bormann's actual fate illuminated the role of timing and luck. Eichmann, captured by Americans, escaped from a loosely guarded facility. Mengele, working under an assumed name, was never properly identified by immediate post-war authorities. Barbie received protection from American intelligence. Each had circumstances that facilitated escape. Bormann, trapped in Berlin during its final battle, had no such opportunity. Maps of the escape routes show the geography of post-war flight. From Berlin to the Alpine passes, approximately 500 kilometers, through territories occupied by Allied or Soviet forces. From the Alps to Rome, another 500 kilometers through a devastated Italy. Then overseas passage requiring documentation, money, and time. The journey required weeks of travel through occupied territories, multiple false identities, and either remarkable luck or substantial assistance. For someone in Bormann's position, in May 1945, this journey was theoretically possible, but practically nearly impossible. He would have needed to escape Berlin while Soviet forces were conducting systematic searches for Nazi officials. He would have needed to traverse Soviet-occupied territory without detection. He would have needed to reach western zones where searches continued. Then he would have needed to navigate the escape network while remaining undetected despite being one of the most wanted Nazis. The fact that other high-ranking Nazis accomplished similar escapes shows it was possible. The fact that Bormann did not accomplish it shows how much depended on surviving the immediate chaos. Those who escaped had time to plan, resources to execute plans, and luck to avoid capture. Bormann had a few hours between Hitler's death and his own, not enough time to reach even the Berlin city limits safely. Historical investigation of the rat lines revealed how post-war confusion created escape opportunities. Immigration controls had collapsed, documentation was chaotic, authorities in different zones did not coordinate effectively, former Nazis maintained networks and helped each other. Intelligence agencies focused on the Cold War, sometimes valued information over justice. In this environment, war criminals could reconstruct identities and disappear. Yet, the same investigation showed the limits of such escapes. Many who fled were eventually found. Eichmann was captured and executed. Mengele lived in hiding, constantly fearful of discovery. Barbie was extradited and imprisoned. Others were tracked down decades later as prosecutions continued. The escape routes provided temporary safety, but not permanent immunity from justice. For Bormann, speculation about escape routes became a historical footnote. The rat lines existed, other Nazis used them, but he never had the opportunity. His escape route ended a few blocks from the Führerbunker, in darkness and explosions, terminated by causes that left no definitive trace but stopped him permanently. The map of Nazi escape routes includes a path not taken from Berlin to South America that Martin Bormann died attempting to begin. Vienna, 1960s-1970s. In a modest office, Simon Wiesenthal maintained files on Nazi war criminals. Born in Galicia in 1908, survivor of multiple concentration camps, he had dedicated his post-war life to documenting Nazi crimes and tracking perpetrators. His work contributed to the capture of Adolf Eichmann and numerous others. Among his most extensive files, the case of Martin Bormann. Wiesenthal believed, with conviction that lasted until the 1973 identification of Bormann's remains, that Hitler's secretary had escaped and lived in hiding. His reasoning was methodical. Bormann was intelligent, had administrative skills, controlled resources, and had motivation to escape. The eyewitness accounts of his death seemed uncertain. No body had been definitively identified. Reports of sightings, while unverified, suggested he might have survived. The files Wiesenthal compiled documented his investigation. They included interviews with witnesses who claimed to have seen Bormann after 1945. Reports from informants in South America, analysis of the escape routes other Nazis had used, financial records that might indicate hidden assets, photographs of individuals who resembled Bormann. Each lead was documented, investigated, and filed. The volume of material was substantial, hundreds of pages, thousands of individual documents, yet none of it proved correct. Every sighting was false. Every lead ended in disappointment. Every theory about Bormann's location was wrong. Wiesenthal was pursuing a dead man, investing years in an investigation that could never succeed, because its fundamental premise was incorrect. This failure was not due to incompetence or lack of effort. Wiesenthal was among the most skilled Nazi hunters, successful in numerous cases. The problem was that no amount of investigative skill could find someone who had died 27 years earlier. The question was not where Bormann was hiding, but where his remains were buried, a question that required excavation, not investigation. The contrast between Wiesenthal's dedicated pursuit and the reality of Bormann lying dead in Berlin soil encapsulates the challenge of historical investigation when physical evidence is unavailable. Wiesenthal worked with the information available: witness testimony, reported sightings, and deductive reasoning about what Bormann would likely have done. All of this seemed to point towards survival and escape. none of it was correct. Wiesenthal's files reveal how logical reasoning from flawed premises produces incorrect conclusions. If Bormann had survived Berlin, he probably would have attempted to reach South America. If he reached South America, he would likely have joined other Nazi fugitives. If he lived in hiding, someone would eventually see him. Each step of reasoning was sound. The initial premise was wrong, making all subsequent deductions irrelevant. The files also documented the human cost of unresolved questions. Families who had suffered under Nazi rule followed Wiesenthal's investigation, hoping that Bormann would be found and brought to justice. Each reported sighting raised hopes. Each failed lead brought disappointment. The inability to locate Bormann became a symbol of incomplete justice, a reminder that some perpetrators seemingly escaped accountability. When the 1972 discovery of remains near Lehrter station was announced, Wiesenthal initially expressed skepticism. He had invested too many years in the belief that Bormann lived. The dental identification seemed questionable to him. He suggested the possibility that remains had been planted or that the identification was mistaken. Only when DNA evidence became available in 1998, years after Wiesenthal had accepted the 1973 findings, was the question resolved beyond any remaining doubt. Wiesenthal's response to the discovery revealed both his integrity and his humanity. He acknowledged that his long-held belief had been wrong. He accepted that Bormann had died in Berlin in 1945. He admitted that years of investigation had pursued someone who was already dead. This acknowledgement demonstrated the intellectual honesty that characterized his work. When evidence contradicted his beliefs, he changed his beliefs. The files themselves became historical documents, not for what they revealed about Bormann, but for what they showed about the challenges of pursuing Nazi war criminals. The investigation had been thorough, methodical, and ultimately futile. It demonstrated both the dedication of those seeking justice and the limitations they faced when physical evidence was absent and witnesses were unreliable. Other investigations Wiesenthal conducted succeeded. His work contributed to locating and prosecuting numerous Nazi criminals. The Bormann case was an exception, not because of investigative failure, but because the subject was dead before investigation began. Yet even this failure served a purpose. It demonstrated that investigators had pursued every lead, examined every possibility, and attempted to ensure accountability even when the task proved impossible. The Wiesenthal files included one particularly poignant document, a letter from a survivor asking whether Bormann would ever face justice. Wiesenthal's response, written before the 1972 discovery, was careful and honest. He wrote that he did not know if Bormann lived, but that the search would continue regardless. Justice, he suggested, required pursuing the question even when the answer seemed unlikely. When Bormann's remains were identified, that pursuit ended. The files were closed, the investigation terminated. Wiesenthal continued his work on other cases, but the Bormann matter was finally resolved. The man who had administered Nazi atrocities from behind a desk had died anonymously in Berlin's ruins, beyond justice but not beyond documentation. The files remained as testament to the effort expended seeking him, effort that, in retrospect, had been directed at empty air. Berlin, 2025. In climate-controlled archives, researchers accessed digitized documents related to Martin Bormann and the Nazi regime's final days. Technology has transformed historical research. Materials that once required travel to multiple archives and laborious examination of physical documents are now searchable databases accessible globally. The transformation affects how we understand and preserve history. Bormann's story, from his rise through party bureaucracy to his death in Berlin's ruins, is now comprehensively documented. Researchers can examine his personnel file, read his orders, study photographs from various periods, review testimony about his activities, and analyze the forensic evidence that identified his remains. The mystery that persisted for decades is now resolved, the evidence assembled and preserved. Yet the resolution of Bormann's fate raises broader questions about historical memory and justice. What does it mean that he escaped punishment? That he died anonymously rather than facing trial? That decades of investigation pursued someone already dead? That some who committed similar crimes escaped while others faced justice? The Nuremberg trials established principles. Aggressive war is criminal, genocide is criminal, and those who order such crimes bear responsibility. These principles remain fundamental to international law, but Nuremberg also revealed the limitations of post-war justice. Only a fraction of perpetrators were prosecuted. Most who participated in Nazi crimes never faced legal consequences. The vast machinery of genocide involved hundreds of thousands of individuals at various levels. Legal systems could address only the most prominent. Bormann occupied a particular place in this hierarchy. He was not a senior military commander who ordered battlefield atrocities. He was not a camp commandant who supervised daily killing. He was an administrator who made the system function. His crime was not direct violence, but bureaucratic facilitation of violence at industrial scale. His guilt was clear, established at Nuremberg. His punishment never occurred. This administrative nature of his crimes anticipated what Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil, the participation of ordinary people performing bureaucratic functions in extraordinary crimes. Bormann signed orders, processed paperwork, and managed personnel. These mundane actions enabled genocide. The recognition that evil can operate through bureaucracy rather than requiring exceptional malevolence changed how we understand complicity and responsibility. The archival materials show how thoroughly the Nazi regime documented its own crimes. Orders were written, filed, and preserved. Personnel actions were recorded. Resource allocations were tracked. The bureaucracy that Bormann managed produced paper trails documenting atrocity. These documents became evidence at Nuremberg and in subsequent prosecutions. The regime's administrative thoroughness facilitated its own historical prosecution. Modern researchers examining these materials recognize both their value and their horror. The documents are evidence of crimes. They are also testament to how organized societies can channel human effort toward inhuman ends. Reading Bormann's orders regarding forced labor or property confiscation is reading administrative language describing human suffering. The disconnect between bureaucratic tone and human consequence is itself revealing. The preservation of such materials raises ethical questions. Should documents of atrocity be freely available? How should they be presented to prevent misuse by those seeking to glorify Nazi ideology? What responsibility do archives have to contextualize materials that document crimes? These questions have no simple answers. Archives balance accessibility with responsibility, making materials available for research while preventing their appropriation for hate. Digital technology creates new preservation challenges. Files must be maintained in formats that remain accessible as technology changes. Security must prevent alteration of historical records. Access must be managed to serve research while preventing misuse. The physical archives of documents and photographs must be preserved while digital versions facilitate research. The technical challenges parallel the ethical ones. For those studying the Nazi period, the availability of comprehensive documentation is essential. The regime lasted 12 years, affected hundreds of millions of lives, and shaped the modern world. Understanding what happened, how it happened, and why it happened requires access to detailed records. The Bormann materials contribute to this understanding, documenting how administrative skill served criminal ends. The contrast between what the archives preserve and what they cannot preserve is significant. Documents capture orders, statistics, and official actions. They preserve less effectively the human experience of those who suffered under Nazi rule. The archives contain Bormann's orders, but cannot fully capture what those orders meant to the people they affected. Historical research requires using documented evidence, while remembering that documents alone cannot convey the full reality of human experience. Modern commemoration of the Holocaust and World War II emphasizes both remembering and learning. Museums, memorials, and educational programs attempt to ensure that future generations understand what happened and why it must never happen again. The archival materials support this mission, providing evidence that prevents denial and distortion. As survivors age and their first-hand testimony becomes unavailable, documentary evidence becomes increasingly important. The Bormann case, resolved through forensic science decades after his death, demonstrates how historical understanding evolves. Questions that seemed unanswerable become answerable. Mysteries resolve through patient investigation and technological advance. The archives preserve not just the evidence of his crimes and the documentation of his death, but also the record of the decades-long investigation, a testament to persistence in seeking truth. Today's researchers examining Bormann's story access materials that would have astonished earlier investigators. Complete files are instantly searchable. Photographs are available in high resolution. Documents from multiple countries are accessible through single interfaces. Technology has democratized historical research, making materials available to students and scholars worldwide, rather than restricting them to those who could travel to physical archives. Yet, technology cannot resolve the fundamental moral questions Bormann's case raises. Should justice depend on whether perpetrators are captured? What does accountability mean when some escape punishment through death or concealment? How should societies remember those who facilitated atrocity through administrative rather than direct action? The archives preserve evidence and enable research, but moral judgment remains a human responsibility that technology cannot automate. Berlin, present day. Near Lehrter Station, A small marker notes the location where construction workers found skeletal remains in 1972. The memorial is subtle, easy to miss among the bustling modern city. It does not glorify or condemn, it simply marks a historical fact. Here, Martin Bormann's body lay buried for 27 years. The marker reflects modern Berlin's approach to its Nazi past, acknowledgement without glorification, memory without celebration. The city contains numerous memorials, museums, and historical sites documenting the Nazi period and its consequences. They serve as reminders, educational resources, and focal points for reflection. The Bormann marker is among the most modest, notable primarily for what it represents. Berlin today bears little physical resemblance to the city Bormann knew. The destruction of 1945 was followed by reconstruction, division during the Cold War, and reunification in 1990. The Führerbunker site is unmarked, deliberately left without monument to prevent its becoming a shrine for neo-Nazis. The Reich Chancellery ruins were removed. The Berlin Wall has been mostly demolished. The city has built over its scars while preserving memory of what happened. The transformation from Nazi capital to modern democratic city spans 80 years. The generation that experienced the war has largely passed. Their children and grandchildren have built a different Germany, democratic, peaceful, integrated into Europe. Yet memory of the Nazi period remains central to German national identity. The phrase "never again" expresses commitment to ensuring that such evil does not recur. This commitment manifests in education, commemoration, and ongoing acknowledgement of historical responsibility. German schools teach the Nazi period extensively. Memorials mark sites of crimes, archives preserve evidence. Legal prosecution of Nazi crimes continued into the 21st century, with courts trying elderly defendants for Holocaust participation. The message is consistent. Germany acknowledges its past, accepts responsibility, and commits to different values. The Bormann story contributes to this larger narrative. He was not among the most visible Nazi leaders. No dramatic oratory, no military glory, no philosophical pretensions. He was a bureaucrat who made the machinery function. His crime was enabling others' crimes through administrative competence. His fate, death in Berlin's ruins, illustrated that the Nazi leadership did not escape or survive, but collapsed with the regime they had built. For historians, Bormann's case demonstrates the importance of patient investigation and the value of forensic evidence. For decades, his fate remained uncertain. Speculation filled the void left by absent evidence. When evidence finally became available, it resolved questions that investigation alone could not answer. The lesson extends beyond this particular case. Historical truth sometimes requires waiting for evidence rather than accepting speculation. For those seeking justice, Bormann's death before discovery represents incomplete accountability. He never faced trial, he never publicly answered for his crimes, he never experienced punishment proportional to his guilt, yet neither did he escape. He did not live in comfortable exile, he did not enjoy the wealth he had accumulated. He died fleeing through a burning city, anonymously, buried in rubble like thousands of others. If not formal justice, perhaps this was a form of rough justice nonetheless. The broader question the Bormann case raises concerns how societies deal with mass atrocity. Legal prosecution can address only a small fraction of perpetrators. Most who participate in genocide or crimes against humanity never face courts. Justice systems, designed for individual crimes, struggle with systematic evil involving thousands of perpetrators. The Nuremberg precedent established that leaders bear responsibility, but implementation of that principle remains incomplete. Modern international criminal law has evolved from Nuremberg. The International Criminal Court prosecutes genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Various tribunals have addressed atrocities in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, and other locations. The principle that such crimes deserve punishment is now established. Implementation remains challenging. Prosecutions take years, evidence is difficult to obtain, and many perpetrators avoid capture. The Bormann case, with its decades of investigation and eventual resolution through forensic science, illustrates both the possibility and limitations of pursuing historical justice. The possibility, even decades later, evidence can emerge that resolves questions. The limitation, legal justice requires living defendants, and death provides escape regardless of guilt. For Berlin, the Marker near Lehrter station is one of thousands of sites that connect present to past. Tourists visit the Holocaust Memorial, the Topography of Terror, the Jewish Museum, and other sites documenting Nazi crimes and their consequences. School groups learn about German history, including its darkest chapter. The city has integrated memory of the Nazi period into its identity without allowing that memory to define everything it has become. The memorial marker is small, deliberate, appropriate. Martin Bormann merits acknowledgement as a historical figure but not prominence. He served evil efficiently. He died anonymously. His remains were found, identified, and documented. The facts are recorded, the marker notes them. Nothing more is necessary. Visitors who notice the marker and learn its significance face questions without easy answers. How should we remember those who enabled atrocity through bureaucratic means? What does justice mean when some perpetrators are punished and others escape through death? How do we ensure that future generations understand what happened without glorifying perpetrators or trivializing suffering? These questions have no definitive answers. They require ongoing reflection, education, and commitment to values that prevent recurrence. The marker near Lerta station prompts such reflection simply by existing. A small stone noting where a man's bones were found, ending a mystery, closing a case, marking a point where history was made visible decades after events occurred. The story of Martin Bormann, from his rise through Nazi bureaucracy to his death in Berlin's ruins to the eventual discovery of his remains, is now complete. The mystery that persisted for decades is resolved. The man who vanished in 1945 had not vanished at all, just died anonymously and lay buried until construction revealed his final location. History has recorded his crimes, documented his fate, and moved forward. The memorial marker stands, quiet testimony that truth eventually emerges, even when it takes decades to appear. Historical truth requires patience, evidence, and willingness to accept conclusions when they finally emerge. The story of Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary who vanished in 1945, demonstrates these principles. For 27 years he remained missing, the subject of investigation and speculation. His fate was resolved not through dramatic discovery, but through routine construction work that uncovered skeletal remains. Forensic science provided answers that decades of investigation could not deliver. The case reminds us that history's mysteries sometimes have prosaic solutions. The elaborate theories about Bormann's escape proved wrong. The simple answer, that he died during the breakout from Hitler's bunker, proved correct. Occam's razor applies to history as to other fields. The simplest explanation, consistent with evidence, is often correct. For those interested in factual war history, the Bormann case provides lessons about the nature of historical investigation, the importance of physical evidence, and the limits of eyewitness testimony. It demonstrates how bureaucratic participation in atrocity constitutes criminal conduct. It shows how post-war chaos created conditions where questions could not be resolved immediately, but required decades to answer. The story respects those who sought justice, those who suffered under Nazi rule, and those who worked patiently to establish historical truth. It acknowledges that some questions remain unresolved, some perpetrators escape justice, and some mysteries persist despite investigation. Yet it also affirms that patient work, scientific rigor, and commitment to truth can eventually answer questions that seem unanswerable. If you value fact-based history, accurate documentation, and serious examination of the past, consider this story a contribution to understanding how Nazi Germany functioned, how it ended, and how we established historical truth about its final days. The facts speak for themselves. The evidence is documented. The case is closed.